So Charlie needs no introduction. He's very well known in the astrophotography circles, I'm sure. His book, The Deep Sky Imaging Premier, is one of the two books that I've learned astrophotography from. And from the books, I can say that besides being a great imager, he's also a great educator.
Thank you.
West Valley Astronomy Club YouTube channel.
Yes.
To see the video.
To see the video when it's recorded, yeah. Yeah. So, you know, Charlie's books, he breaks down his stuff and really puts it in clear terms. So I've really enjoyed them, and I'm looking forward to learning a lot in today's presentation. And I'm an unabashed fan of his, and I'd like to recommend all of his 3 books. Charlie's doing this for the goodness of his heart, and we really appreciate that, Charlie. So before I let you just take over, I'd just like to ask you, Charlie, how would you like to handle questions?
Good question. I've kind of broken the presentation into 4 parts. So maybe it makes sense that I'll pause at the end of each of the 4 parts, and we can, you know, answer questions and have a discussion then.
Okay. All right. And if people want to mute their mics, that'd be good, so we don't have any side talk going on. And if you want to send me questions by chat, do so as well, and I'll keep looking at the chat and pose them if you don't want to pose them yourself. Okay. All right, Charlie, it's all yours.
Awesome. Thank you. And I will warn you, about every 5 minutes, there'll probably be just a little hiccup. I'll try to keep an eye on it. Let me know if anything is glitchy and you miss anything that I'm saying. This computer, for whatever reason, I can't fix, seems to do this with Zoom. So let me share my presentation. And I'm on a gigantic monitor. Does that look okay to you?
Yes, it looks great.
Guys?
Yeah, it looks good, Charlie.
Yes, the Veil Nebula.
Okay. All right. Yes, yes. One of my favorites. Just starting to swing back into view here. So, yeah, so I do a couple of different talks. I customize them a little bit each time. This one is fairly basic. I'm not going to go into deep discussions of signal to noise ratio or anything like that unless you really want to. This is my attempt at sort of quantifying the little things and the big things that you can do to improve your image quality. So let's jump in. Let me start with the picture for me that started it all. So I was 7 years old when this picture was published in 1983. I remember it on the my grandfather's coffee table, seeing it. And this is one of the absolutely fantastic image of the horse head for 1983. This is one of the premier astrophotographers of all time. And I would say if you were to post this picture now on cloudy nights, people go, it's
We lost you, Charlie.
okay, it's nice. You know, probably hung up there for a second, didn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you were to post this picture now, people would say it's good. It's not great, because what's crazy is that with the technology we have now, I think most amateurs can match this image pretty early on in their attempts at astrophotography. And that's fantastic. So this is the agenda for tonight. So what I've done, I've broken 4 different approaches to improving your images into getting more data, getting better quality of data, better resolution, and then getting the most out of the data through processing. So I'll kind of structure the presentation in these 4 areas, and I'll use that as a chance to pause for questions for each of these. So just a little bit about me. Thanks for the introduction. I mean, I've got 3 books that I've written. I'm working on a couple other projects right now, including at some point I'll get the 3rd edition of the Deep Sky Imaging Primer out. But I do custom editions of this astrophotography planner for people if you're interested in that. astrophotography, Sky Atlas, working on an app and a couple other things. So this is sort of my side gig, if you will, astrophotography, and happy to be inspired at the age of 7, but I didn't start until about 2010, 2009 with this. So I thought about this, and I thought, how can we group the different factors that drive image quality? But also, I want to flag some of these are just very easy, and they're cheap. You can do them without much effort. And a lot of these, it's a little sad to admit it, but like equipment quality has an impact. And so some of these things just cost money. So I'm going to try to flag which ones these are, because when you're first starting out, you don't want to commit a ton of money to this hobby until you know that you're really going to be with it. So I'll flag which ones are sort of expensive, which ones are not, as we go. But yeah, this is kind of the structure. So let's start out with getting more.
Lost you again, Johnny.
And this is really the name of the game. There's one thing that you can do. Simply capturing more data is always better. You do get diminishing returns, but this hobby is all about collecting as many photons as possible. So I've got a couple of different sections within each of these. So this is kind of the menu of things that we're going to go over, and we'll cover each of these subjects in a little bit of detail. But just to emphasize the part about getting more data, this is a hobby that you need to think of every image as a project. And when I first started, the idea was, ooh, there are 3 things in the sky tonight. I'm going to try to take pictures of all of them. And then pretty soon it was like, well, let me just maybe focus my time on one. And then pretty soon it's like each night is only a small portion of what you're going to try to do. So this is an image of the Tulip Nebula, just as an example. This was taken over 4 nights last year, 159 subs. That was after paring it down. So this is 13 hours and change of total integration. This is a pretty typical narrowband image. And so this is a multi-night project. And if you've ever tried to image the Spaghetti Nebula, Simiis 147, this is a notoriously difficult one. And this is kind of the extreme example of that. This is 1 5-minute exposure. You will see absolutely nothing. This is with a hydrogen alpha filter. This is if you take that same exposure and you just stretch the heck out of it. You start to see, oh, there's that little nebula, there's a little sharpless nebula up there and some structure. It's only when you take almost 100 images and integrate them together that you, and even this is probably pretty overstretched, that you really reveal the structure of the nebula. And the reason for that, if you go back and do the math and figure out what you're actually dealing with here, and let's zoom in on this little spot here. This is 7 photons difference in brightness between the background and this little wispy part of the nebula right here per exposure. So in a 5-minute exposure, the area of nebulosity gets 7 more photons than the background. So that is why we have to take such long total exposure, not individual exposures. That's less important, but the total exposure time for a lot of objects needs to be so long. In Simiis 147's case, that's just to reveal it, much less take a great picture of it. But more is definitely better. So this is just to set up why more is better and why this first category is probably the most important. So one way to get more data is to do actually what I did with that picture and what I used to do. This is the most expensive way possible you can imagine to capture more data, is to run parallel telescopes. I don't recommend it. It requires 2 cameras, 2 telescopes, 2 sets of filters, and a whole lot of pain, because imagine every time something's gone wrong with your focus or anything wrong with your camera or the filter wheel, you just double the chances of things going wrong. But once you get it going, it is definitely possible to image this way and get twice as much data each night. Not the recommended path, but one way you could do it. A cheaper approach is to think about your setup. So imagine it's really cold outside. you've had a long day at work, you come home and you're like, oh, it's perfectly clear outside. How many times has that happened to you? And then you're like, you know what? It's just such a pain to set up right now. I'm just not feeling it. I'm going to go to bed. So if you get that down to 5 minutes, you're much more likely to get out there. And so this is like setting aside all your equipment and everything else, simply shortening the time, making your own life easier for setup is one of the best things you can do to get more data. I always say, like, one of the first things I did years ago was I just put little half bricks down in my lawn where the tripod legs could go. And that saved a ton of time in finding north and getting everything lined up. I knew that I could put my telescope tripod out, plunk it down. I knew it would be roughly aligned right away. That was great. That alone, that takes no time at all. You can put these in your yard for 5 minutes and for $2. More recently, in the past couple of years, I built a very simple pier. This is known as a Todmorden pier after Todmorden Observatory in the UK. It's literally 2 cinder blocks bolted and glued together in a concrete footing in the ground. Very simple pier. I like it because if I decide to remove it, if I move, it's extremely simple to take it out of the ground. And then I also got all of my equipment. I got a little mini computer right here, power, everything in a nice box, cables nicely aligned. Between the pier and having all my computer and equipment lined up like this, literally 5 or 6 minutes. I just have to load the telescope in my yard. I don't have an observatory, just put it out there. I know where everything plugs in, walk back in, and I can communicate via remote desktop through the wireless network with my mount and everything and the computer out there. So my setup time is now 5 minutes, and I rarely miss a clear night. So very simple things you can do, get more data. Also, plan your night. So figure out what you should be looking at tonight. Where is it going to be positioned? You don't want to image it when it's too low. And you want to make sure it's well positioned for your trees, whatever is in your way. So you can look at, I use Stellarium. I used to use Carte de Ciel, and Telescopius is also excellent to plot out where something's going to be for your location for a given night. Of course, you got to check the weather, make sure everything's there. I love clear dark sky. I think Spheric is fantastic as well. It's great that we have multiple astronomy weather resources now. But yeah, think about where the object is going to be positioned for you, because you want to image objects when they're high in the sky. And you want to get them at the time of year when they're going to be in the sky a lot. So if you want to plot out what the evening's going to look like, or sort of figure things out very visually, for Stellarium, I love the fact that you can just turn on the azimuthal grid and see, and you can just, this down at the bottom here, you can just page through the hours and watch the object that you want to try to image that night move across the sky and see where it's going to be. How long is it going to be well positioned? The other thing is Stellarium in the upper right-hand corner has this excellent place where you can enter your sensor, you can enter your telescope, all that information there, and it will help you frame up your object to make sure that it's going to fit, make sure your telescope or your sensor is turned the right way. Stellarium's free. It's incredible. It's the best free software out there for astronomy, I think, other than Nina. So take advantage of Stellarium if you're not already. The only plug I'll give here is just the other thing to think about is, am I imaging this object at the right time of year? So that was something I found myself playing with Stellarium a lot to figure out what is the best time of year to take a picture of an object for where I am. So I ended up writing this book to answer that question for myself. It was based on my own notes, and then I created into a full-fledged published book. But the idea is to say, okay, for instance, the Crescent Nebula, which I'm actually literally imaging right now in my backyard as we're talking. Right now in mid-June, from where I'm at, it looks like I can get about 6.5 hours of time when the sky is dark and the object is high enough in the sky to image. If I wait until September, I can get 9, right? So maybe it's not the best object for me to be imaging right now. If I wait till September, I'm going to get a lot more bang for my buck out of every night that I take that object. And then I think the last one in this section is get a better mount. And you hear that if you go on any of the forums, where should you spend your money? Spend it on the mount. And it's true, because as I've gone up in mount quality over the years, and I'm now using a Takahashi EM200, I was shocked when I moved from the C-Gem, which is like my mid-grade mount for many years, to the Takahashi. I was used to throwing out 20–30% of my subs, and then I got this, and it was like, you almost never throw anything out unless the wind blows or something, you know? And that just means you're getting more data, right? You're just being more efficient. That said, I acknowledge, I put the big dollar signs up on this one because good mounts are expensive. This is, you know, I got this used, but even then, it's the most, you know, one of the most expensive pieces of equipment. It costs at least as much as my best telescope. Okay, so that is, sorry, there was one more. And this is automate your imaging. This also was something that overcame a big limitation for me, which was I used to only be able to image when I first started out until the object reached the meridian. And then if the meridian happened, let's say 1 in the morning, I wasn't going to stay up to do it. I had work the next day. So I would just image up till the meridian, stop. And then I was only getting half the night. So when you move to automated imaging, and this is a screenshot of Nina, but you can use Sequence Generator Pro or Max Pilot, or however it's pronounced in French. There's a couple of different options now. It's fantastic. It just totally changed my whole approach, because not only does it manage the meridian flip, it allows me to, I was talking about how maybe an object right now isn't well positioned, but I can do one object that's well positioned early in the night, one object that's well positioned later in the night, and then just keep doing that night after night and still accumulate a lot of data. The ability to manage this automatically and then just go to sleep is absolutely priceless. And it's also one of the other keys to getting more data. And it's not expensive, right? These are all Sequence Generator Pro, I think it's $100. Nina is absolutely free. So that's it for the first section of getting more data. Let me pause there before I go into getting better data, just to answer any questions here.
I don't see anything in chat either, so.
Okay, very good. All right, so let's move to the next section then. So this is about getting better quality data. I'm going to bring automate in again. As the first piece for getting better data. And the thing that it does fantastically, I can tell it to refocus every 30 minutes, or I can tell it to refocus every filter change. I can have it refocus based on the temperature. If there's more than a 3-degree change in temperature, I can have it refocus. But not having to throw out a bunch of subs because they're slightly out of focus because the temperature changed is absolutely fantastic. And the ability, you know, Nina's ability to do this, their parabolic focus curve is actually excellent now. So this is a great way to sharpen up your images. Another super easy, very cheap, actually free thing to do, and it's critical with modern CMOS cameras where the primary spatial noise is fixed pattern noise, not columns, dithering. So the idea here is that you're just basically going to deliberately, between each exposure, just bump the camera or bump the telescope, point it just a couple of pixels in random directions, just a little bit off each time so that all the images don't line up exactly. So if you can imagine the sensor here looking at let's call it a blank piece of sky, there's a little bit of fixed pattern noise where each of the photo sites is very slightly more or less sensitive. And if you keep taking image after image, all you're doing is lining those up so that they reinforce that fixed pattern noise, so that you can see the pattern becomes more prominent over here. This is just sort of a schematic of it. With dithering, you're taking each picture so that they slightly are off each other. And the effect there, when you then later in the registration setting, you line up all the stars, these now become a background that is much more neutral because you've used the fixed pattern noise of each of the other pixels to cancel out the ones around them, basically. So you're just taking an average across space. So if you're not dithering, and all you have to do if you're using a sequencing program, literally click a button and say, just dither, and tell it how many pixels you want to do it, and it's going to take care of it for you. But this will have a huge impact on, people see a lot of, they call it walking noise or rain noise in their images, where there's just slight differences in, maybe your darks aren't completely accurate. Maybe there's just fixed pattern noise in your sensor. But then when you line up all the exposures, you get these sort of rain patterns in your image. This is how you get rid of that. This is the problem for most of us, is skies. They're just, and where people live, there are going to be lights. And so most of us live in areas where there is a lot of light pollution. There's a lot of sources of light pollution. The moon is the natural one. And we were just talking about that. We've got a couple more days before the moon reaches first quarter. And that's about usually first quarter to last quarter is pretty much the no-go zone for most broadband imaging. Narrowband imaging can get around that. Artificial lighting, I mean, obviously you can move, but you're gonna have to move out to the country. Remote imaging has become popular, I think, for this reason. And then narrowband filters. I do most of my imaging through narrowband filters. I focus mostly on nebula these days because the light pollution in my area just keeps getting worse and worse, especially with LED lights. And then I joke that if air glow is your biggest source of light pollution, you have the ultimate in first world problems for astronomy. The other big transition, going from a DSLR to a cooled camera. Not only does cooling the sensor give you less total dark noise, it keeps it consistent, which makes it easier to subtract it out. So it's less about the lower noise, although that's important. If you ever imaged with a DSLR on a hot summer night, and you guys would have, if anybody would, you know how much noise there is in the dark current of those cameras. But the ability to subtract that out consistently because your camera was kept at a consistent temperature is very effective. The other thing I'll say is a modern camera. So I was pulling this chart together for future edition of the book the other day, and I've kind of divided the past 20 years or so into these eras where you can kind of think of the premier or most common cameras of the 2000s as the SBIG 2020 base cameras and the 11,000 base cameras. Then in the 2010s to about 2020, the 8300 camera was big. And in the past couple of years, the 1600 cameras, which is based on this Panasonic sensor, have become very popular. Just in the past couple of years, though, literally available commercially through ZWO at reasonable prices, the 455 and 571 cameras. So this is the 6200 and 2600 series chips is what you would know them as for the ZWO models. And I just want to draw your attention to the fact that the read noise on these cameras has dropped, tremendously. In the case of the Panasonic chip, that read noise didn't translate into a huge change in dynamic range because that camera didn't have a very high full well capacity, which meant you had to take really short exposures. But these new Sony IMX chips, you look at almost 14 stops of dynamic range. That's 2 stops greater than previously. Quantum efficiency now, because they're backside illuminated, over 90% peak quantum efficiency, which means almost every photon that hits that sensor is going to get captured, whereas you were losing about half of them before. Dark current. I mean, this is also huge. The 571, I mean, it's arguable whether you really need to take darks anymore with these cameras. So just huge technological improvements. I can't say enough good things about these new Sony chips and the cameras that they're in. They're just a huge step above anything we've had in the past. I don't know where we go from here. I mean, I don't know how much more sensitive and noise-free they can get. This is even more expensive than buying a new camera, though. Faster optics, right? So this is, I'd say that without getting into the sort of the F ratio myth debate and everything, think of the speed of the optics as answering the question of, do I have enough aperture to support the focal length that I'm about to image at? So I've used the focal length to determine how big my field of view is and how much do I want to sort of zoom in on an object. But if you don't have enough aperture to support that, you're not going to be creating a very bright image on the sensor, and it's going to take longer for you to capture your image. So it's also optically difficult and expensive to control aberrations as you get faster and faster optics. So this is where we spend a lot of money on getting, especially for refractors, getting a fast refractor or buying a high quality reducer to make it fast. The great bargain right now in fast optics are Newtonian astrographs, right? So you can get a really, really nice f4 Newtonian, and a great coma corrector is probably the best value for fast optics, aside from maybe one of these fast manual focus telephoto lenses. But Newtonians obviously have you know, their strengths and weaknesses as well there. But moving from f7 to f5, remember, it works based on the square of those two numbers, the ratio of speed. So f5 is twice as fast as f7. So you will be gathering essentially twice as bright an image, or you can think of it as, to get the same signal to noise ratio, half the imaging time at f5 versus f7. And also I'd say once you start imaging it like f5, it's really hard to go back to slower optics. And then narrowband filters. So this is the one way we have to level the playing field for one type of object. So for emission nebula that only emit light at very specific wavelengths, narrowband filters allow you to pretty much have the same kind of dark skies as if you had dark skies, even if it's light fluid. It's pretty close to closing the gap with a dark sky sight for that type of object. So if you think of it this way, let's say this is sort of, you know, this is 300 to 800 nanometers wavelength. This is like the visible, approximately the visible light spectrum. You've got all this light coming in from sky glow. But your emission nebula is only emitting light from ionized gas. In most cases, hydrogen alpha is going to be your dominant channel. And it's literally not emitting light at other wavelengths. So the sky glow is dwarfing the number of photons that you're getting from the object. Something, let's say it's 100 to 1. With a narrowband filter, you've blocked out everything not at that wavelength. So you've blocked out all that sky glow, but kept 100% of the hydrogen alpha light that's coming in, right? And so now you're looking at a ratio of something, let's call it 1 to 1 now, right? So, and you can imagine that even at a dark sky site, if you reduce this, it's still not making a massive difference in what you're getting.
7 o'clock.
Can I ask people mute their mics, please? Thank you. Carry on.
So you've probably seen a lot of images like this. Of course, these are mapped colors, so this is not the actual color of the Sol Nebula, but it is physically accurate in the sense that you are seeing different types of ionized gas in different colors, and it does correspond to something physical out in the universe. And like I said, this only works for emission nebula, but for those of us like me in very light polluted areas, this is how I can, capture these objects. It wouldn't be possible otherwise. Okay, I'll pause there. Any questions about that? So.
2 questions on the chat here. Is it okay to dither every other sub, or is it better to dither every sub?
Great question. I personally dither every other sub myself. It depends on how long your subs are. So if you're taking a full night of 1-minute subs, if you're dithering every time, remember the dithering is taking, can take 20, 30 seconds sometimes to dither and stop, settle, start guiding again. In that case, if I'm taking 1-minute subs, I'll dither every 5. If I'm taking 5-minute subs, narrowband or something, though, I'll dither every single exposure. The key is just not to reduce, not to spend your whole night dithering, but you want to dither as much as you can. Yeah.
Okay, the next question is, if F5 is twice as fast as F7, does it cut to use an F5 and crop the image? Will the resolution be the same or comparable?
So in that question, it comes down to, that's where it gets a little complicated, because what are we holding constant when we do this? So if you're holding focal length constant and you are just changing the F ratio, that just means you're changing the aperture at that point. So in that case, the resolution would be as good, but that's not usually the case. Usually the focal length is changing as well as the aperture. So basically, I would say you can always trade off resolution for improved signal to noise ratio. So that's the sacrifice you want to make, that you want to take a picture where the object is very small in the image. You will get a very clean looking image, but you will lose resolution. You can think about it this way. How many times have you seen an image that, even of your own, it looks really good when you look at it just as a thumbnail, like you post it on Facebook and it looks really good just as a small image. But when you zoom in, you're like, ooh, wow, yeah, there's a lot of noise there. It doesn't look as good. That's literally you making that trade-off of resolution for signal to noise ratio, because you're essentially averaging over a larger space each pixel, and therefore you're getting a better measure of what the brightness actually is in that area, but you're losing the resolution in the process. So your question is surprisingly complicated in the sense that we'd have to sit down and figure out exactly what F7 scope you're talking about versus what F5, and is the camera the same, or did you change the camera's pixel size too?
Okay, then a question of my own, Charlie. You haven't mentioned cameras, meaning mono cameras versus color cameras, and I understand that you get quarter of the light into each pixel because of the spread locally on the chip itself. But I'd just like to hear your comments. Is that a big trade-off worth doing? I mean, yeah. A lot of us do it just for time reasons, because
it is very yeah, it's very easy. I will say the main reason I'd say to go to mono is probably the narrowband more than anything else. Like, it is true that you will ultimately get a slightly better broadband color image from a mono sensor, and you take it through filters, right? Because you're getting color data on every pixel in all your exposures. You also open up the opportunity to bring in luminance data. So you can definitely improve your signal to noise ratio by taking luminance and red, green, and blue. And then if you can appropriately blend the luminance in later, the luminance is getting 3 times as much light as red, green, or blue. And so it inherently has a better signal to noise ratio. So going mono opens up LRGB imaging, and it also opens up narrowband imaging. So for those 2 reasons alone, it's worth it. But what you lose is the simplicity, right? You lose now you got to take 3 or 4 sets of flats. You're going to have, all the expense of the filters and the filter wheel and things like that. So the trade-off is simplicity versus higher quality. Okay.
Yeah, some of us are using, like myself, color camera with with a multi-narrowband and the filter, like the L enhance,
Mhm.
and hopefully trying to get away with it.
Yeah, and it's great. I think you lose a little for bright O3 objects. It's pretty good. I think for dim O3 objects, it's hard to pull out that oxygen channel. You get a pretty noisy oxygen channel. But yeah, the technology, those tri-band and even tri and bi-band filters is just fantastic.
Well, thanks.
Okay.
Oh, there is another question popped up. Oh, couple of questions popped
Oh,
up.
cool.
Sorry, I'll just go through them. Let me see if there's more. Okay, we just had a very high wind, 60 plus miles per hour blow through here in Grand Canyon. Oh, the monsoon has arrived. So it's just somebody commenting.
So you're not imaging, is what you're saying tonight.
Question, I'm using Nina with PhD2 and many of my sequences call for 60-second subs with a dither every 3 frames. However, when I blink the subs, they seem to move far too much and are impossible to stack with WBPP.
Mm-hmm.
Is my pixel setting in Nina wrong?
Interesting.
I understand the question. Maybe you want to explain that a little.
Yeah, so if they're too far apart, remember the dithering is being done by your guide camera. So if your guide camera is very short focal length or has really large pixels, moving just 1 or 2 pixels at that scale on your guide camera might translate to a lot more pixels at the full focal length of your imaging camera. So yes, in that case, you want to reduce the number of pixels you dither to 1 pixel or half a pixel or something like that, because your guide camera pixel is corresponding to much greater movement for your imaging camera.
And you do need a guide camera to dither.
Well, you need some kind of guiding, yes. So you can do off-axis guiding as well. Yeah.
Okay, we can continue.
Okay, excellent. Great questions, guys. Thank you. All right. So if we continue here, I'm going to again bring one back. Getting the best mount you can not only means throwing out fewer subs, but also translates to better resolution. Just better tracking is going to be better resolution. Better mounts just track way better. Even with auto guiding on, you'll still see an improvement with a high quality mount. So again, this supports that constant adage that they always tell beginners, like, buy the best mount you can afford. But guiding is also something you should be doing as soon as possible after you start imaging. I like to joke, there's a lot of people, and there's nothing wrong with it, but they spend a lot of time getting amazing unguided tracking, and they build a T-point model with 50 points, and they've got everything just really dialed in. It just seems like a lot of work when auto guiding, especially for those of us who don't have a permanent setup. Like, that makes sense if you have an observatory. If your setup is not permanent, auto guiding will make even a mid-range mount perform way above its class, and even the best mounts will improve a lot. So this is like one of the big jumps that you make as sort of early on in your imaging career, is going from just DSLR to CD. There is manual to sequenced, and then I think of like not auto guiding to auto guiding. It's like these are like the big transitions that you make. And again, it's not expensive. The principle is very basic. So this is my backyard. I sort of pasted over what the sky was like at this time. And all it's doing is you just have a small, cheap camera on a small, cheap guide scope, and it is monitoring how far that is drifted. And the software looks at that and translates that for your mount and said, hey, for the next 2.5 seconds, just slow down for a second. You're going a little too fast in right ascension. Oh, nope, speed back up. Oh, no, slow down. That's all it's doing. And the software is free. The equipment is not very expensive. You can get a guide camera for about $100, and you get a 50mm finder for less than $100. Put those two things together with PhD2, and it's a huge jump in image quality right there. Now, a more expensive part of this is focusing. So number one is just the focuser. And this is such a shame that this is the corner that gets cut to make the optics cheap. And it kind of irritates me to this day that almost no scopes come with imaging quality focusers built in. And it's such a shame that you buy a $1,000, $2,000 telescope, and then you have to go spend $500 more to replace the focuser. Takahashi focusers, I think, are pretty good. I haven't replaced mine. I know some people still complain about them. But yeah, focusers are really expensive, and it's the sag that you get, so the weight of your camera just pulls where the bearings meet, just pulls it down, and you end up with part of your frame focused, part of your frame not. You end up with it, if it's a little bit loose and it wiggles, you end up with a focus that, over the course of the night you're constantly fighting that. And a good focuser just, fixes all that. In order to automate your focusing, though, not only do you need to buy a good focuser, you also have to buy a stepper motor to drive that focuser and a controller. So there's additional costs. Again, it's hard when you're budgeting, your first kit, so to speak, for astrophotography, and you realize the telescope and the mount are just the beginning, that in addition to the camera and the filters, you're thinking you're done, and they're like, no, you got to replace your focuser, now you got to get stepper motor. Like, it's kind of an endless thing. I guess this is true of most hobbies, but when you're just starting out, I will say, to truly dial in focus, a Botanoff mask is amazing. You can there's websites online, you can enter your telescope and print one out. You can order them for about $20. There's a guy on Cloudy Nights, I think, who makes custom ones for scopes all the time for about $20. That is the minimum for dialing in focus, but really being able to refocus as temperature changes, refocus by filter with automated sequencing software, that's the key to really maximizing your whole night. And then we talked about faster optics earlier, and that's just sort of concentrating more photons onto the sensor. But better optics give you a sharper view. And there's all sorts of aberrations. We don't have to go into these, but for refractors, you've got chromatic aberration. For Newtonians, you've got astigmatism and coma. For Rishi-Chrétiens, even those, you still have some astigmatism. All of these things are, let's say, logarithmically correlated with price of the optics. You've heard of, all the different glass types of refractors, like the FPL53 and FCD100. All of those things in a triplet can nearly get rid of chromatic aberration. But if the lenses aren't well figured, none of that matters, right? So it's very expensive to make quality fast optics, but you do, in some sense, get what you pay for here. I wouldn't trade my Takahashi FSQ 106 for anything. That scope is just, always performed for me, and kind of solves a lot of the problems. It brings its own problems, but it kind of solves the ones on this page. But the other thing to think about is, beyond just the quality of the glass, is some of the mechanics. So we talked about the focuser, but also, does it stay in collimation? Is it going to handle the temperature change across the course of a night? There are a lot of scopes that struggle with these things, where the space between the lenses change, or the length of the telescope tube changes due to temperature, or it just flexes and collimation won't stay right. All of these things, again, the quality mechanics beyond the quality optics are also something you're paying for when you get a premium telescope. And then here's a free one. I set 30 degrees of altitude as kind of my limit. I really won't go below that unless it's just something that never really gets above 30 degrees for me. And the reason for 30 degrees is somewhat arbitrary, but that's the point at which you're looking through two air masses. So if you can imagine, when you look straight up, you are looking through a certain amount of atmosphere. As you look down toward the horizon, you're looking at an angle through that atmosphere. So you're looking through more air. One air mass is the amount of air you see going straight up. At 30 degrees, you're looking through 2 air masses. At 20 degrees above the horizon, you're looking at 3 air masses. At the horizon, you're looking at, it's hard to even say, but approximately 40 air masses. And that's why you see, the air acts like a lens at that point. And that's why you get it distorted. You know, like the sun, when it's right above the horizon, it's flat. And that's where the green flash comes from. All sorts of optical aberrations happen. So I stick above 30. I found that's a pretty good threshold. 25 if I'm really desperate to get more time on an object. But there's 4 things that happen as you get closer to the horizon. So you literally lose a lot of photons. So you can see at 30 degrees, you are only getting 77% of the light that you would if you're looking straight up. So things are slightly dimmer as you go down because you're just looking through more air. That effect is not equal for all colors. So it affects blue light more than red light. Also, like I said, the air acts as a lens, and you get, and you've seen this if you ever just even look through an eyepiece at like Venus when it's close to the horizon, right? You see it sort of smeared out into a little bit of a rainbow, and that's because refraction, essentially, it's like a single element lens, right? So there's no control for chromatic aberration. This is the chromatic aberration of the atmosphere. And then finally, seeing is just terrible. You're just looking through, there's just that much more motion of the air or undulating, if you will, sort of the air to just ruin the resolution. So all the more reason, all you have to do, keep above around 30 degrees. And that's kind of the sweet spot for imaging, but the higher, the better. Okay, that's it for the 3rd section. Any questions on this one before we go into the last one?
I don't have any on the chat, so if anybody has any, I think we can continue.
Okay, good. Let's see, we're coming up on about 50 minutes.
A question.
Yeah.
The thought that occurred to me as we were talking about cameras, a lot of people shoot with DSLRs, and there is a tendency in some quarters to move towards modifying those DSLRs.
Mm-hmm.
Any comments on those? And you know, there are some people who are also replacing, not using the batteries, but putting in a dummy battery with a power supply.
Yep.
You can reduce the battery noise for long exposure. The battery warming up also probably is a source of noise.
Yep.
Any comments on modification as an alternative?
Yeah, so I do recommend that if you're not buying a camera that was designed for astrophotography, that having the filter replaced dramatically improves the response to H-alpha. That's all it can do. But considering most of the emission nebula that we take pictures of primarily emit in H-alpha, you will see a huge improvement, like 4 or 5-fold improvement in the brightness of emission nebula when you do that. So I have a Canon 6D that I use when I'm traveling, and yeah, the modification was expensive but worth it. It does make it a little more difficult to use the camera. You have to set a custom white balance if you want to use the camera for other things, because you definitely messed with it and you avoided the warranty. But yeah, that's definitely worthwhile. As for replacing the battery, there were a couple Canons years ago that really, like there's like a battery dependent noise going on or something there that really seemed to be a problem. I don't know how much of a problem that is for every camera, but it definitely is going to reduce the heat load, taking the battery out of the camera and powering it with one of those little AC adapters. And again, for like $12 on eBay or Amazon, you can buy those little AC adapters, and that's fantastic. The only time I wouldn't, if you were in the field and just doing nightscape photography or something, it probably doesn't matter that much. But I think you definitely reduce your temperature by taking the battery out of the camera that way.
All right, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can proceed. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yep. So I've been very bold of me just to even put up a pre-processing and post-processing on here. I just wanted to say, like, that's a multi-day topic. This is where you spend most of the learning curve, I think, of astrophotography, is figuring out what to do with the data once you get it to maximize it. So I'm just going to skim the surface of the topic here a little bit, but I will say for pre-processing, sort of the three major things available out there right now. Deep Sky Stacker is available. It's free. I don't have Sigil on here. I know that's starting to get some traction for both pre and post processing. That's free as well. I have switched recently to using AstroPixel Processor. I think it's fantastic just because it has a lot of number one, it has really great default settings, but number two, it does do some intelligent decisions about your images and just makes it easy to get the best pre-processing you can do. And for mosaics, there is nothing better for mosaics. If you're taking mosaic, you can just dump the images into APP and it figures out what to do. It's incredibly efficient for mosaic. So that's what I use for my pre-processing right now. PixInsight is my primary tool for post-processing, but for pre-processing, and I should define this pre-processing, I'm defining as calibration, registration, and integration. So correcting your images, subtracting out dark frames, dividing by flats, then registering, lining up all the images together so the stars all line up, and then integrating, which is basically averaging them all together appropriately. That's pre-processing. PixInsight will do pre-processing and post-processing. I used to complain that PixInsight was terrible at pre-processing because everything was manual. I will say the latest version of this WBPP, this is weighted batch pre-processing, the new version 2.1 is strikingly user-friendly compared to the previous version. So I'd say it's a pretty viable choice. PixInsight, well worth it for less than $200, I think, when you convert the euros. Gets you a full pre-processing and post-processing. But if I were just starting out now, I'd probably go with Deep Sky Stacker, AstroPixel Processor, just for ease of use. Even with WBPP, it's not quite as user-friendly as the other two options here. Don't be afraid to throw out your bad subs. I was happy I saw in one of the pictures there, you're blinking your subs. You're like, hey, I looked at these subs in Blink. Blink is a process in PixInsight that allows you to basically quickly look through all your sub exposures. Don't be afraid to throw out the bad ones. Even the mediocre ones, those high passing clouds that can come over, those can be ruin your signal to noise ratio. So I toss not only the ones, if there's a focus problem, a tracking problem, a high cloud passes over, don't be afraid to throw those out. You do not have to throw out airplanes, meteors, anything like that that just affects a certain number of pixels. That'll be taken care of in the averaging process by the statistical algorithms that exclude outliers. So when you see like sigma clipping or Winsorized sigma clipping, things like that, they will exclude those automatically. And that's what I was saying here is that make sure you're not just doing a pure average. And I don't think the default settings are rarely like that. But also this idea of quality weighting. So that in the final stack, you want it to weight your best subs the highest and put less weight on the lower quality subs. All the applications I just showed you now have a way to do that. That's also highly recommended. And then I do recommend at some point to really understand what's going on in the process so that you can tweak it better. It can be useful to try it once you understand it in something like PixInsight and like literally go through and use the all the different individual processes to manually calibrate and see what happens and try different things just to get a feeling for what's going on under the hood. For post-processing, it's important to set the expectations that the learning curve is long, but even once you've, mastered, which I don't think you can ever really get there given the number of tools available, it's a big process. I would say that for a typical image, I spend at least 4 hours on the processing. And I kind of have in my head a set path that I go down for a galaxy versus an emission nebula, things like that. But even then, like you're like, just no, this isn't quite right. This object requires something a little different. And this is where the artistic expression comes in this hobby. And this is where you're making choices that you could give someone else the same data, they come up with a different image. And that's what's interesting is seeing, I love it when you see online, well, somebody will post the raw data and you'll have 10 people process it and you'll come up with like 10 very different looking images. And that's always very interesting to hear about the different choices people have made. But there really isn't a flow chart or a recipe that you can use that, you know, this is the way to do it. And I see a lot of people post these very long, elaborate, you know, workflows for PixInsight. And it's like, well, that's one way, but you got to look at it. It's like, it's better if you understand what each of those options is doing. So you can say, no, that's not right for this image. I need a lot of that. And I need to do this first before that because of this reason. So as you get better, you understand how to put all those tools into place. The biggest thing that's surprising, I think, for a lot of beginners is they're processing their images and they don't effectively remove the gradients. And if the gradient from the darkest to lightest place in your image is, let's say, 10% in brightness, it's going to be very hard to reveal subtle details in your object that have less variation than 10%, right? You can imagine that. So if you get that background all even, suddenly all the details of your object will pop much more. And like one of the easiest things you can do is get that gradient removal process right. AstroPixel Processor has a very good, it's a light pollution removal tool is what it's called. But I still think the gold standard is PixInsight's dynamic background extraction. And if you pick your points correctly, you can, if you want to pick points that only have the background in them, you can get your image very, very flat. And that flatness of the image allows you to stretch the object more. You can actually apply more stretching to it and it will just stand out more. The other thing recently, StarNet++, man, this has just changed a lot for us in imaging. This is a machine learning algorithm that's trained on images with and without stars, and it can pretty effectively remove the stars in your image. And if you can think about it, the stars are usually the brightest things in the image, especially if you have a nebula, if you're imaging an object like a nebula or even a galaxy. The stars are going to stand out as the brightest thing. So all the stretching you're doing to try to pull out the faint details in a nebula or the outer arms of a galaxy is just blowing out your highlights on these stars. And so it's kind of ruining the image. So StarNet allows you to, there have been ways in the past to do this, but they've never been as effective as StarNet to pull the two things apart. Then you can really nicely stretch your dimmer object and then bring the stars back in. So I absolutely love StarNet. I use it, I probably overuse it. I try it at least on every image, I think now. Beware of noise reduction tools. They can cover up a little bit a lack of data or poor quality or something like that, but ultimately, usually they only create more problems. They either make your image look too plasticky, or by eliminating fine noise, they actually increase larger noise, which causes the blotchiness effect you see in a lot of images. They just look kind of blotchy because what you've done is you've gotten rid of all the high frequency noise. Now you've revealed sort of the medium and lower frequency noises in your image, and those are even harder to get rid of. So go easy on the noise reduction. Sometimes it's better to have a noisier image. It can actually look better and certainly more real. Less processing is usually more. That kind of goes without saying, but it's you got to figure out which less processing to do. That's what the all-day exercise is ooh, I processed this for 4 hours and I realized, oh, halfway through was much better than I got to the end. So back up and then go from that halfway point a little bit. And then finally, I always tell people, step away from the computer. Before you share the image with anybody, step away for a half hour, come back. I guarantee you've been looking at it too closely. You're not seeing it. It's probably oversaturated or you've overdone something. And you need to step away and come back and go, whoa, okay, you don't have fresh eyes. Regular artists do this, painters do this, photographers do this. You should as well. So those are my tips for the last category for optimizing pre and post processing. This is kind of the lay of the land of everything that we've looked at today. And since you're recording this, right, if anybody wants to sort of pause this and have a look at all the different things that we talked about. But this is kind of a high level view of all the different things, hopefully with some structure applied to all the different things that you can do to improve your imaging. One last slide here before I go to the final questions. I did resort them a different way. So I took those 16 things that we just looked at and I rearranged them by which ones you can do now without spending any money versus the ones that, like, in the long term you should aspire to do, right? So shortening your setup time, auto guiding, sequencing, these are all things, they don't cost a whole lot of money and they will make a huge impact on your image. In the longer term, as you buy new equipment, think about if you're not using a cold or recent camera or a mono camera, to Amin's point, faster optics, narrowband filters, and an excellent mount. These are all the things that, you know, should be the sort of the direction that you're moving, but you don't have to run out and buy all those things now, especially until you've sort of mastered auto guiding, you know, got your sequencer working, things like that. And these ones with stars are just sort of the high impact ones. So with that, I think we've come right up on the hour, but I'd love to take one last round of questions.
Yes, thank you very much. That was really instructive. I'll go through the questions on the chat right now, and then we'll just let everybody open up their mics, and anybody who wants a discussion, maybe we can do that.
Sure.
I don't know how late it is for you, Charlie.
It's getting there, but I've got an imaging run going anyway. So.
Okay. All right. This one is from Tom. What is the best software for reducing star population? Many of my images of nebula are overwhelmed by the massive amount of stars.
Yeah. So so StarNet is just amazing, and StarNet is part of PixInsight, but you can also download it on its own. So it's a command line program if you just want to run it on its own. It requires, at least in the current version, a fully stretched image. And what I typically do is I will fully stretch the image, run StarNet to pull the stars out, and then run something like morphological transformation, which is a process in PixInsight. You can, it's like the minimum filter in Photoshop, but with more control, to shrink the stars and then I stretch the object and then I bring it back in. But you're absolutely right. The stars in your image will overwhelm a faint nebula just visually and just detract from it. The other thing to know is if your stars are overwhelming your image too much, think about how long your subexposures are. If you are clipping your stars, that could be something that's happening there, and you just need to dial back the length of your subexposure time so that your stars are not being clipped.
Okay, and the next question from George. What attributes constitute a great image? Some seem so manipulated that they lack realism. I used to think great images are what you would see if you travel closer, but it was pointed out that that would not be the case.
Yeah, so, you know, it's funny. I think it's what you want is a natural looking image, but the truth is that you're absolutely right, that if you got closer to a lot of these objects, they still wouldn't look like any of these pictures. What we are doing, we are magnifying not only in size in most cases, but we are greatly exaggerating the brightness of these objects and also exaggerating the dynamic range. And you know this because when you look at the picture that comes right out of the camera and you see that little spike on the histogram, all of, you know, the whole background is in that spike, and the object is probably just, you know, a little bit to the right of that spike. And when you look at your final stretched image, you take that little bit of dynamic range that the object lives in, and you're spreading that out across the whole dynamic range to make a pretty picture. So what that tells you is that the dynamic range of these objects is actually very narrow. And even if we could get close to them, they wouldn't look like the images that we have. So all astrophotography has some element of artistic choice involved there. But what you want is you've got to figure out where that line is for you, as far as how far you want to go, but also it should look natural. And I think you've got a great point there that they look manipulated. If it looks like it's been photoshopped, there's some sincerity that is lost in the image, and that usually the biggest indicator for me is usually it looks like too much noise reduction has been done. And I was guilty of this earlier in my image processing. I've found that every year I use less and less
Right.
I have less and less tolerance for noise reduction in my images. I think that's the big thing that makes it look, or also the other thing you see is they look fake because the black point has been clipped too much so that the background is completely black. And what that does is, yes, it hides the noise in the background, but it also, it just doesn't look real anymore.
A couple of other things in the chat. Number one, I suppose, is from me. Yes, this presentation is being recorded and will be on our YouTube channel. And as I said before, you can Google it, West Valley Astronomy Club YouTube channel, and you'll get to the channel and see all the videos that are out there. And I should be able to post this particular video probably in a couple of days' time. The next one is basically Charlie's link to Charlie's website, which is also right now on the slide. So those of you who want to follow Charlie, take that link down and you'll be able to see what he's up to in the future.
Not very high tech, it's just an old school blog, but it's a good place to sort of put recent images and what's going on. But yeah, listen, it was fantastic to talk to you guys. Like I said, there are more detailed, deep mathematical dives and other presentations I've done. So I hope you felt this sort of struck the right level of helpful advice, and I hope you found something that was useful in it for you.
Yeah. I hope you won't mind us coming back and requesting more from you.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I'd be happy to. Once you guys have digested this one, we can come back for seconds.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Charlie. Really appreciate your time.
You're very welcome. You guys have a wonderful evening.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Charlie.
You're welcome, Bob. Appreciate it.
There's a question, or Tom, were you going to say something?
I was just saying thank you, Charlie.
Thank you, Tom. Appreciate it. You guys have a wonderful evening.
You as well.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Me, thanks. It was a wonderful presentation.
Yeah, it was very good, wasn't it?
Yep, just the right level.
Yeah. Yeah. So we'll have them back again.